Well, you're tuned in to another episode of the Zelos podcast. I'm your host, Rocky Snyder. This week, Kyle Moore, who's the associate head athletic trainer of the Las Vegas Golden Knights NHL hockey team. These guys are just kicking butt all season long here. We're going to find out behind the scenes how he keeps his players on the ice, out of pain, and at their top level of performance. Be sure to click subscribe. Follow us on Instagram at Rocky_Snyder, and away we go. You know, Kyle, I can't thank you enough for coming on the show. This is going to be a really fun conversation, I can already tell, because a lot of the information you've been seeking for your own professional benefits kind of parallels some of the things that I've been working on or focusing on and learning. And so I think we can speak a lot of the same language. First of all, Golden Knights, you guys are at the top of your division. Fantastic job with that. And a big part of it is keeping your players healthy. So congratulations for where you are already in the season as we come to the end of the year. What do you attribute, first of all, to the not only the skill level, obviously the players getting you up to the rankings in number one, but what do you contribute yourself to help with a successful recipe?
Yeah, thank you, first of all, for having me. I'm excited for this opportunity. And to answer that question, yeah, we've had a lot of success for the start of the season. We've been able to stay pretty healthy so far to start out the year. And collectively, as a group with our performance staff, we really do. We know that we don't have the obviously pure influence of a win or a loss, but we try to contribute as much as we can to player availability, players playing to their peak performance levels, to hopefully set them up for a chance to win and to perform well. So how much that is, I don't know, but we definitely try to do the best we can to make sure the player is able to perform the best they can.
And so just if you could kind of elaborate on like your therapy philosophy and what kind of professional development classes have influenced you the most. Why don't we start from there? And because I'm curious to know how many rabbit holes you've been traveling down and what you've accumulated over the years.
Yeah, so I actually did this. I didn't really know what my therapy mindset or therapy philosophy was. I always had ideas, and an exercise I did with myself was I kind of put together on a whiteboard and just started brainstorming and putting it down on paper. And it was a great exercise to see what it was. And I think the foundation for me is, especially on a soft tissue based injury or a chronic injury like a tendinopathy or something like that, really trying to find what that underlying cause is. I'm a big supporter of the idea that something is the underlying cause to these issues. It's what I've seen clinically during my career. It's what's made sense for me. It's where I've seen success with it. And digging deeper to try to find that layer and that cause has really been the goal of really any clinical case that I would have in that realm. And also taking that, trying to be as objective as possible in not only taking the subjective feedback from the athlete, but taking as much objective information as you can, whether it be range of motion, strength assessments, posture assessments, movement assessments, whatever anyone would want to use, and then give the intervention that you feel is going to be beneficial, and then reassess that again afterward to see if you've actually made a change. I think that's been a big foundation for me as well, to see if I'm getting the change that I want. And then also implementing some sort of corrective exercise along with that. I know that's a very loosely used term these days, but I still like it in the sense that you want to try to make something stick, right? Like if I'm making a lot of passive changes on an athlete, I want that to stick with active implementation. So, and then that'll go into their typical dynamic warm up, and then they'll go out and play their sport. And the way I've always looked at any sport I've worked with is that the body's going to adapt to that sport that's being played. The body wasn't meant to be skating on the ice, in my opinion. So there's going to be lots of adaptations that happen. And then after that, when they're performing their sport, we try to get them to recover and come back down to their normal postures and things of that nature, and continue to reassess over time on how we can influence and how we can treat to avoid these soft tissue and chronic tendinopathies and things that we hope that we can actually have an influence on. Are we ever truly going to be able to prevent everything? I would be on the side of saying no, but I think we can influence things a lot and set the body up for success. So that's kind of been my kind of mindset that I've put down throughout the years, that I've really tried to build my clinical mindset around.
Nice, because that goes away to some degree against the conventional symptom-based approach when it comes to non-contact injuries and just treating the symptom site without necessarily considering the underlying cause, as you say. So I'm curious, with that, do you try to extract as much of a history of timeline of your players from even from birth? Like, what was their birth? I don't want to get too extreme, but did they have a natural or normal birth? Were there episodes there? Were there childhood injuries, fractures, surgeries? Was there extreme dental work? Do you go that extreme, or do you just kind of get a general understanding of what their experience has been, which might lead up to the underlying cause? How deep do you go?
We try to be as thorough as possible. It's an exercise we do with every athlete that comes in. Is we basically just gather as much of a clinical injury history as possible, and that is anything from a concussion to your basic orthopedic injury, surgeries if they go back to the childhood years, things of that nature, to just get a sense of what adaptations we can maybe predict a little bit when we have a little bit something in our mind, when we do a bit of an assessment to see what's going on. We really try to take the previous medical history as a starter and to be as thorough as possible for us to hopefully look at things that, like, they may not have any complaints now, but how does that hip labral surgery look now compared that you had to 5 years ago? How's your range of motion? Like, things just to keep in mind. That's just one small example, but something to have in the back of our mind when we're doing an initial assessment of the athlete.
So, not to throw physical therapists under the bus, it's not what I'm intending, but you got a lot of players who have had injuries that have gone through some type of rehabilitative process, typically with a physical therapist, but there comes a time where they stop that. And in that time that they stop may come before they are fully, truly rehabilitated. Do you find that often? Or do you find that, and I'm not talking about your team's staff, but just in general, the athletes that come across your table and in your treatment rooms and so on, do you find that they are fully rehabilitated after injuries, or is there still kind of a shadow there?
I think there's definitely, every case is individual in that matter, but I think even if there certainly are some limitations sometimes, but I've seen it with cases that I've taken care of, in the sense that the more they skate and the more they get further out, they're going to have some adaptation based on that previous history or previous injury. So I think, does it happen? Yes. And that's where we try to be as thorough as we can to identify these adaptations to prevent them from turning into secondary injuries. I definitely do think that in the professional sports world, I think we bridge that gap from, like, clearance to play, but also clearance to maximal performance. I shouldn't say clearance there. What I mean by that is we try to be as objective as we possibly can, and try to make sure that not only are you safe to play from the injury clinically, but are you at your peak performance and your baseline levels for you to be a positive contributor when you get back on the ice. So I think that's the gap where I think we can really bridge that gap between being medically cleared to play, but also cleared for full performance, and hopefully that comes at the same time.
Well, let's talk about that gap for a moment, if you don't mind, because as I see it, like you mentioned, corrective exercise, and people can give it whatever terminology, but for the most part, we understand what you're saying. Are there movements to clean up improper patterns, compensatory actions, just to overcome some kind of inhibition, if you'll call it, or over facilitation, whatever the case may be. But often we see corrective exercises set up prior to a conditioning program, strength conditioning, and then they go into their routine in the hopes that the corrective exercises are setting them up to better execute the movements that are in their program. But therein kind of lies a gap, don't you think? Like, shouldn't there be some type of like progression, regression of an interwovenness of the corrective strategies that blend into strength conditioning, taking into consideration their previous injuries and so on. Do you know what I'm trying to get to? It's almost like, here, we'll throw corrective exercises up into the program and we're just going to wish for the best. That's kind of a sense that I get, not from you. I just mean in general in our industry. It's like, okay, you've given them some correctives and now go ahead and do your routine. I think there needs to be a little bit more interwoven fabric and closing that gap more. Am I off with that, or what do you
No,
think?
I think you're right on, and I'll go back and answer a piece of your first question, in the sense that the one thing that I've deep dived into from a professional development side is Posture Restoration Institute. And I've really utilized PRI to be that gap between I'm a big manual therapy fan. I started my manual therapy with ART, and I've expanded that into dry needling, neurokinetic therapy, and just trying to get as much experience. I really do think that we can influence the soft tissue of the body with our hands. I think we can influence that really well, but I only think that matters if you then take that passive intervention and couple it with an active intervention. And that active intervention for me, that's been really has been really good, has been PRI. It's really helped me get things to stick for the passive interventions that I'm doing with manual therapy. And the piece that to talk about that specific gap that you're talking about, because I do agree there is a gap there. And clinically, I use PRI exercises or specific kind of modifications to exercises they've done to make it a little bit more specific to the athlete. But I think the most important piece to that is communication with our strength and conditioning staff. I think the having a high level of communication, because like we view and myself, I view an athletic trainer and a strength and conditioning coach as a member of a performance staff, right? Like we're in the same business. We're trying to get an athlete to perform the best that they can. And when you have that high level of communication, you can bounce exercises off each other, you can ask significant questions. And that in itself, I think, is going to close that gap between an athlete who is getting ready for activity to go out and perform at their best. I think that's going to really be the method to close that gap that you spoke about.
Well, you also are not only what you just mentioned with NKT, PRI, TPI, all these letters that you've been pursuing knowledge from, but CSCS, Certified Strength Conditioning Specialist, as well. So you've got your foot on both sides of, I won't even say the fence, but on both sides of the medical and performance to some degree. How do you utilize that knowledge with CSCS with the ATC? How have you blended those together to perhaps better communicate with the performance staff of the strength coaches and so on? Do you do that? And if so, what have you found?
What I've found with that is it's given me a really solid foundation for conversation, because I do not practice as a strength conditioning coach. Like you mentioned, I do have my CSCS, but that was something that, as I've developed through my career, I've definitely 100% been an athletic trainer way more than I've been a strength conditioning coach. I've never practiced solely as a strength conditioning coach. And I leave that to our strength conditioning coaches that are way better than me at programming, and way better at me at player development and all the things that are necessary for a strength coach to be great. I think it has helped me in the past with having some foundational knowledge to have constructive conversation on what we feel we need, what a player needs, mainly in a post-injury conversation, because that's the world that I live in. It's given me like I think a solid framework to work off of, but by no means have I gotten to the point where I've been an elite strength conditioning coach by any means. It's not what I focus my time on.
No, I totally get you. But what I'm curious though is that I guess the question is when to load. So you're dealing with the players that are having some issues, whether it's movement patterns, whether it's just tendinopathy, whatever the case may be, and then they need to go eventually get back into the weight room. What kind of assessments? Because I know you're one of those guys that, you know, in order to know if this is valid, we need to assess, do that movement, reassess to see, are they ready for this? So I guess the question is, what kind of assessment tools do you use in order to understand when you need to load your players and when they're not ready for it?
Yeah, quite simply, with the first thing that come to mind with that is, are they pain free? Are they pain free through everything I'm about to talk about? For one, do they have full range of motion, actively and passively, and can they produce full isometric force without pain? And I focus only on the isometric because concentric and eccentric is going to come naturally with a loading progression and the rest of a rehabilitation. But I want to know, can you fire that muscle to a baseline level if we have the measurement? If we don't have the measurement, then we're going off of probably a bilateral assessment to see if both are equal. But if they can isometrically produce force without pain, that's telling me muscle fibers have gotten to a point where they've healed enough where pain is not being created. Can I put that tissue all the way on stretch without pain? That's telling me the fibers are ready to be loaded. That's the big things we look for. And then also tenderness of palpation too. If there's no pain to palpation and full range and full isometric capabilities, that's where we typically have the loading begin, which again is still a very very close process between the athletic trainers and strength conditioning coaches. I mean, it's a nonstop flow of back and forth. One of the things that I really like to do is, when I'm able to, we have a high-low table in the gym, and I like to treat up there when I can, just so that I can, not because I'm trying to like watch over things that are happening, but just so I can observe, the programming styles, the coaching styles, how an athlete looks while they're moving, and just I try to be as integrated as possible with that. Be there to provide a intervention if needed, even mid-session, just be able to get some extra hip extension or get some extra dorsiflexion or whatever the case may be, just so they can have a more high quality training session. So those are things that I've tried to do to make it as integrated as possible. But I think I don't see a gap between athletic trainers and strength conditioning coaches personally.
Not in that environment, I bet.
Yeah. It's a combination effort the whole way through, and I think that you lose those gaps, and you're unsuccessful in those gaps when you're not working well together.
And when it comes to let's just say the common injuries for the NHL players, adductor strains, maybe high hamstring pulls, there's certain protocols historically for such things. And I imagine, and I'm just guessing, but you'll have to kind of steer me in the right direction here, but maybe as a young up and coming athletic trainer, there is certain beliefs with these protocols. If this is occurring, then you need to do A, B, and C. But you yourself, over the course of time, have learned that each body is individual in its ability to move and create strategies or negotiations around the issues in the tissues and so on. So the approach to, say, an adductor strain may very well not be the protocol that has been laid out historically. We might need to take a different approach. Did you struggle with that? Or was that something that you just jumped into and said, of course, this makes complete sense, and I'm not going to go with the, I won't say conventional, but maybe the previous understanding of what we should do?
Yeah, I think of a couple layers with that. I think the first thing is you were right with what you said, that early in my career, I definitely, as an athletic trainer, what your job is to work in the direction of a physician. That's your job. That's what athletic trainers do. And you get a post-surgery protocol, or you have protocols from the clinic you work through, or things like that. And I think those serve as a good foundation, right? Like, as long as they're clinically up to date, with the current literature that's out there, I think those serve as a great foundation. But I'm ultimately not a fan of protocols. I think every rehab is its own individual thing, and that's also where it comes down to, as an athletic trainer, to having a very close and very trust-based relationship with your team physician or your supervising physician, to where they're comfortable with what you want to implement or what you want to tweak to the protocol, and just have these conversations ahead of time, because the athletic trainer knows the athlete at a very high level, and knows their previous medical history, like you mentioned, to be able to meet the benchmarks that we need to throughout a rehabilitation process, which is necessary. But I think the method of getting to each one can be very individualized to the clinician and also to the patient. And that's where the happy medium is, for, in my opinion, to see the best potential benefit.
So anecdotally speaking, yeah, without mentioning names, you have a player that revealed to you in a way how the symptom is not necessarily where the underlying problem may lie. Can you recall a time where that hit you like a brick wall, where this low back issue was actually coming from a 5-year bout with an inversion sprain that happened 5 years ago, or with something along that line? Was there something that made you go, oh my gosh, what the heck is this all about? I want to learn more.
Trying to think back if I had like the one moment. I mean, it's definitely something that's evolved over time, but I've just always had the thought process of that, if an injury occurs without contact, right? If an injury occurs without contact, then the site of the injury can't be the problem. Like, the way the body, like, that part gave way for some reason. And I think PRI opened my mind to that a little bit, because that's a very kind of whole kinetic chain, whole system focused techniques. So I would definitely say that opened my mind to it when I took my first PRI course early on in my career. And it just makes so much sense in my mind that that's how these things work. Like, there's numerous times where I have athletes come in and they're complaining of tension through their adductors, and I don't even treat their adductors, and that tension goes away. And it makes sense, in the sense that we can influence these tissues without addressing the tissue itself. Do I treat the affected area as well? Of course, there's still times where you need to work through a trigger point through a muscle, or work on getting some increased range of motion through a joint, through that soft tissue. But it's especially tendinopathy too. I mean, tendinopathy, the tendon's screaming at you because something else isn't working right. And it's the more time I've gone through in my career, the more I've seen that it makes sense, and I've had positive results. So it's something that, again, is very closely related to the training side of it. And there needs to be adaptations to training programs made after the fact for those things that hopefully never don't come back again. So that again goes back to the connection between strength and conditioning and athletic training that I view is necessary for the athlete to have the best experience through throughout a season or even through an injury rehabilitation process.
And you've been associate head athletic trainer with the Knights for how many seasons now?
This is the 6th season.
6th season. And have you had the same strength coaches on the team too?
Yeah, so I've had the same strength coach with me my last 2 years in the minors as well. So our one strength conditioning coach, his name's Doug Davidson. He and I have been together for 8 seasons now. So we both came over to Vegas at the same time, and that in itself has been amazing. He's a brilliant guy, and we work very well together. Gotten to know each other very well, and I think it's really brought the whole performance picture together for us to have seamless transitions from the athletic training side and the strength conditioning side.
And why hockey, Kyle? What got you into the NHL and before that the minors?
Yeah, so it's an interesting story. So I grew up a hockey fan. I always appreciated the athlete. I thought they were one of the most exceptional athletes out there with what they have to endure over a season, playing multiple times a week.
Flyers or Penguins?
I was Flyers growing up.
All right.
And which was interesting because then I worked for the Penguins. But so when I was in undergrad, I originally was looking at football, just because I think I was a little bit bigger of a football fan than I was a hockey fan growing up. I played a little floor hockey growing up, but not anything competitive hockey wise really. And so when I first got into athletic training, realized I wanted to do athletic training, I was just trying to get as many internships or experiences as I could possibly get. And my hometown, I'm not from Reading, but just outside of Reading, Reading has an East Coast Hockey League team called the Reading Royals. They still have one today. And I reached out to the athletic trainer, and he was happy to have me come in over Christmas break. And I got a chance to observe him, and I got exposed to the hockey world. Like I got exposed to the hockey culture and the level of family atmosphere there is, the respectfulness from the athletes. And I'm just a kid coming in off the street, essentially just looking to get an observation experience. And I got an amazing cultural experience. So once I had that experience, I'm like, I want to work hockey. This is where I think I can work with a high level athlete, but also work in a very family oriented atmosphere, very positive culture atmosphere. And I tried to gear all my experiences in hockey after that.
Hey, podcast listeners, I want to let you know I will be on the East Coast this January to teach 2 courses of anatomy and motion. The first course is on Saturday, January 21st at the Perform Better Functional Training Institute in West Warwick, Rhode Island. It is a full day of understanding closed chain biomechanics of the lower body. Following that, I will be in the South Boston area of Hingham, Massachusetts to teach a 2-day course all about upper body biomechanics as it relates to the gait cycle. So if you keep scratching your head about your clients or athletes' recurring pain symptoms, it could be a matter of compensatory patterns. Once you get an understanding of how the body is supposed to move, you can compare it to how your athlete moves. Notice the difference, what's missing, and then have a better idea of what to do about it. To register for one or both courses, go online to my website, rockysnyder.com. Click on Courses and Workshops at the top of the page and hit the register button. This information has truly been game-changing for me, and not just me, for many of the Zelos podcast guests as well. So I hope to see you this January in Rhode Island as well as Massachusetts. So hockey is quite different. I mean, not just culturally, but in terms of movement too. We've got a greater deal of frontal plane action, of course, when skating, and forward backward motion is greater than a lot of sports too. But the primary difference is the footwear or the contact and the ground surface that these athletes have. How, from an athletic training standpoint, balancing on a blade, going over slick surfaces, and having to move the body, not necessarily in sprint mechanics, but altered states of sprint mechanics. How how does that relate to your role? Is do you know what I'm trying to say?
I do, and it's something I think through a lot. In that, the biggest thing is the effect on dorsiflexion of the ankle, because
How
I
so?
I think the ice high. Some players lace up their skates different than others, but it generally limits dorsiflexion. I mean, it allows for some, but I think it limits it, and that over time causes joint restrictions through the talus, posterior chain restrictions through the foot and the calf, and I think it just wreaks havoc on the rest of the chain. I think it wreaks havoc on the pelvis, which therefore wreaks havoc on the hip, and that's why probably the primary soft tissue I treat on a daily basis is a glute med. Glute medius is always hypertonic. Then start talking about lumbar erectors, and then you start talking about hip flexors and all these things that get put in a bad position when the pelvis is compensating for a lack of dorsiflexion. So we really try to focus on that. Like it's a measure we take. We try to keep track of it throughout a season. Does someone have a history of a high ankle sprain? High ankle sprains are the absolute worst. Like if I sometimes I get asked a question of what's the worst hockey injury, and people are expecting all this gory stuff and this and that. And for me, it's a high ankle sprain. It wreaks havoc on the biomechanical function of not only the ankle joint, but the knee and primarily the hip. Um, I've seen a lot of anecdotal evidence of just guys with histories of high ankles. They have issues up the chain on that hip, and it's something that we try to really treat our way through, because that scar tissue lays down and it stays there forever. But I mean, we can try to at least influence it to be in a better state so that ankle can function better.
Makes complete sense. I mean, a lack of dorsiflexion at the ankle is going to require more sagittal plane motion, potentially further up the chain. Are we going to have a greater degree of knee flexion? Are we going to have a greater degree of anterior tilt of the pelvis or hip flexion? You're not going to be able to get true hip extension potentially.
Mm-hmm.
So therefore the glute max isn't going to be participating as much. And with all that frontal plane abduction of skating down, I could definitely see how you get hypertonic in that glute medius. So with that known, when it comes to transferring that information to your buddy, the strength coach, do you guys do a lot of loading into dorsiflex positions for the ankles? Can we just drive them more into it? Can we get them to access that even when they're in the training facility? Obviously, you're not going to get it as much if they're lacing up the boots really tight, but do you try to offset that in the on the dry land based training, so to speak?
Yeah, we do. So we really try to couple, and this is where that level of communication I think is high. I try to work through the soft tissue and the joint restrictions of the ankle the best that I can to gain dorsiflexion, and then we try to couple that with some lifting exercise, either even some basic mobility exercise that's really driving that shin over that foot, to try to get as much of that positive shin angle as we can to drive those changes home. And I try to take a similar approach with the hip extension that you mentioned as well. I'll do a lot of soft tissue work to try to gain as much hip extension as I can, and then that's then a piece of their either prep activity or their lifts are geared towards maintaining the ranges that we got. And it's not you'll see changes in a one-time intervention, but it's going to be something that's focused on for the coming weeks to try to really get that to be something that sticks.
And so, you and I have something in common where we look down at the foot quite often. 28 bones, 26 of them are meant for movement. They got the two sesamoids that are just more like pulley systems for a windlass mechanism. But in essence, you got 33 joints down there, but they're all laced up tight. And without proper dorsiflexion of the ankle, you're not going to have a lot of proper pronation mechanics of that foot. So do you address like what's the plantar surface or the plantar tissue doing under the foot? Do you do a lot of like manipulation, mobilization, or even for that matter, dry needling of the lower extremities? What else do you do to affect that, to try to reduce the likelihood of that high ankle strain and so on?
Yeah, I do definitely look at the plantar aspect of the foot. I haven't done much dry needling at the bottom of the foot just because I don't think I've had an athlete that has had a level of comfort with it yet. I will certainly do a lot of dry needling through tib anterior, try to decrease any hypertonicity through there. That's been really successful as well. But the thing that I'd say the most bang for my buck with is the talus, in being able to make sure that talus and subtalar joint can it distract from the joint? Can it move anterior posteriorly? I see a lot of limitations with the talus sliding posteriorly to limiting that dorsiflexion as well. So what I'll do is I'll just have someone, I'll passively take them into full dorsiflexion. I'll ask, okay, do you feel like you're stopped because of a stretch in your calf or Achilles area? Or do you feel like the front of your ankle is jammed up? And more often than not, I hear the front of the ankle is jammed up. And it's because, in my opinion, the talus can't slide posteriorly. So if the talus can't slide posteriorly, it's not going to be able to get out of the way for the ankle to dorsiflex. So that's how I've really influenced, I think, it the most, along with all the secondary soft tissue compensations, like certainly plantar aspect, flexor hallucis, like all your typical structures that you want to try to loosen up with that. But yeah, I would say that the joint mobility of the talus has been my biggest bang for the buck to get some positive effects on dorsiflexion.
So you take a band around the anterior portion of that talus and distract it back, anchor it back behind the heel and have them drive into dorsiflexion? Or do you just manually just block that talus from gliding forward and try to hold it as they dorsiflex? What's your approach to that?
I'll do both. I'll primarily do hands-on joint mobs first, and then I try to do it mainly with my hands, just because I think I have the most control over it. And I'll have them go into half kneel, and I'll have them take their essentially knee over their foot, and I'll be really doing my best to hold that talus posteriorly. That's kind of as a bit more of an active component to the passive joint moves that I just did, and I think I see success with it. You get feedback from athletes that say like, "Hey, I feel like I could get a little bit lower on the ice without having to get in a bad position." Because I mean, at this level, these athletes are very aware of what's going on with their bodies in a like a practice environment, right? Like they're not going to take note of that during a game, right? But in a practice environment or like a skills session skate where they're focusing on certain things, they can feel these things. They know their bodies. So it's something we definitely try to make a focus of, just because of its effect on the rest of the chain, primarily the hip, I would say.
Do you like puzzles? Do you like being a problem solver?
Yeah, I think I also just try to be as truly proactive as I can. And what I mean by that is, like, I want to be the clinician going to the athlete saying, "Hey, we've worked on this in the past. Let's take a quick look at this and see if anything's going on." Like that in my mind is proactive. I think even when an athlete comes in and say, "Hey, my groin's a little tight, can we work on it?" Yeah, that's going to start a whole process. I'm going to assess everything and try to figure it out, which I love doing as well. But they still came to me. I didn't go to them. So I try to be as truly proactive as I can be to stay on top of any of these things. I take notes of what I see works for certain things for players. Like some players end up being a lot more quad dominant than others, so they have classic rectus femoris, vastus lateralis tension issues. Other athletes, they go through it with their hips, and it's classically a glute med and a lumbar erector. Sometimes some guys are more SI joint, and I try to track these things. I'm talking from a non-injury world right now. Like I'm talking from truly a preventative state. I try to track these things, and I try to, when I have the time, try to build connectivity and build trust with the athletes to be able to say, "Hey, we've worked on this in the past and we saw this. Can we take a look at this today and see if everything looks good?" And sometimes it looks good and they're on their way. But other times it's back, but it didn't create a problem yet. Whereas if in my opinion, if it's let go and it continues to function that way, a problem will arise.
Got it. Okay, so curious with your experience with PRI and the fact that you have players that are inherently asymmetrical, partly according to PRI, but also the way they play. There's a certain hand that holds low on the stick compared to high. You know, you've got left-handed players and right-handed players. How does that play back and forth into each other? Do you know what I mean? Like with PRI, heart on the left, two lobe lung compared to three lobe lung. It sets us up with a rib cage shape, which sets us up posturally almost preset to be a certain way. Are you noticing just within your own experience, like, is there an overlay with that? Do you play along with that, or does it get your head scratching going, I wonder what that's all about?
Yeah, I would definitely, the way I think about that is with, like, I certainly agree with the way you just described PRI, right? Like PRI has its defined patterns that are there. And I think that that is great, but those patterns are completely altered when you're dealing with an athlete of a sport, right? So I think skating puts such a odd demand on the body. I definitely see more right-sided issues or more left-sided issues with the way their shot is and different parts of the body. I definitely see that for sure. But that's where I rely on assessment and reassessment. That's where, if from a PRI lens, I look at it with an adductor drop test, right, or a passive straight leg raise. So like I always try to assess, take everything into account with what the athlete is and what position they play and what handed they are and all those factors, but still go back to my foundational assessments, right? So I'll still assess them with things that I think are valuable assessment wise, and then make my interventions appropriately, and while all keeping in mind what that athlete has to do on a daily basis as well. Because the way I've always looked at it is that skating, like, we can make all these corrections in the world, even over weeks, right? Over weeks of time, and people are gaining this and gaining that, and they're making this is sticking. They're still skating on a very regular basis, which is an unnatural motion for the body. So things are inherently going to come back, right? They're not just walking around every day. So I think because of the specialty movements required for skating, it's inherently going to mess everything up, for lack of better words. So
yeah, and there isn't anything that offsets it, right? There isn't any movement you can think of that would counteract it.
That's what we try to do. That, like,
right.
we try to be the offset, so they have a higher tolerance for skating. Like, I think that eventually the tissue is going to catch up to the tolerance, and that's where I think injuries occur. But if we can keep that gap further away, they can perform and play at their sport at a very high level with hopefully a less injury risk.
Yeah, it makes sense. And there are those within the industry that say, okay, as soon as you start changing the way in which they move, you could diminish their athletic skill sets, their athletic ability, their accuracy. But I don't see you finding that. Like, the players don't come back to you and say, you've just messed up my slap shot.
And that's not what I'm trying to do, right? Like they got, any professional athlete in any sport got to where they are doing things a certain way. I'm never going to try to change someone's stride. I'm never going to try to change the way someone shoots. They need to do that the way they've done it their whole career, because they've made a career out of it. And our job is to hopefully just be able to influence those things to hopefully have a decreased injury risk.
Okay, so let's talk about a little bit of the off season, because I recall back when I was studying with TPI, they were looking at the world's leaders for the long drive championships, and what they found in the off season, they were doing things that were countering. By some were frisbee throwers, some were hockey players, but they were left-handed rather than being a right-handed golfer. When it comes to managing like player care in the off season, not just like activity wise, but like, there's a lot of players that go back to their hometown or go on vacation, and they've got their own coaches, their own therapists, their own body workers they see. How do you communicate? How do you negotiate or manage that care in the off season?
Yeah, I think it first comes down to trust with the athlete. I think if you've gained a great relationship and a great trust, a great level of trust with the athlete, I think that's the foundation of everything that we're about to talk about go very smoothly, because I think most of these athletes, they have people that they trust away from the team. And I think that's great. And I think the best part about the off season is you have to focus on that communication. You have to focus on communication on things that we've seen throughout this past season, things that we've seen that have been successful for this athlete. And if you have those conversations and have an initial introduction, it usually goes very well. It ends up being a really great dialogue, similar to what we're having right now. It ends up being a great dialogue of respecting what we've seen, respecting what they've done historically, getting them up to date on the players' injuries that year, and just being able to have a good conversation to be able to keep an eye on the athlete while they're in their off season. It's actually gotten to the point where if it's more talking to more of a therapist in like a post-injury situation, obviously the level of communication there has to be even higher to make sure the rehabilitation itself is going on. We'll even actually maybe mix in some site visits just to not as a checkup to make sure everything's going right, but more of a side of just seeing in person stuff that you can't see on a video, or you can't see on in a phone call or something like that. It's also driven by professional development. I've been exposed to a lot of things from other therapists that I'm just like, I never really thought of it that way. And then I look into I ask about the techniques they've learned and courses they've done, and it's driven my professional development. So ultimately, just being open and wanting to communicate, because ultimately, the more you communicate, the more smooth that is, the better experience the athlete's going to have, and that's the reason we're all together and working on it. So it's been a good experience in working and getting exposed to these external therapists, strength conditioning coaches, to just be able to get the best outcome we can and learn.
And is your curiosity, your curious mind, directing you in a certain place right now in terms of your own education, your own professional development? Is it motor neurology? Is it fueling? Is it sleep patterns? Where are you looking currently?
Currently, I'm still working through TPI, so I still have a little bit of ways to go with that. So that's where my current focus is right now, I would say, and I'm still working on implementing NKT with how fresh it is. One thing that I have been wanting to do it just hasn't worked out schedule wise is anatomy trains has had a bunch of dissection courses just to kind of refresh my anatomy knowledge and just really make sure that I'm staying on point with that, because I had a cadaver experience in graduate school, and it's been a while since I had that experience, and that's really been being able to know what's underneath your hands when you're working on someone is huge. So I've been looking at those courses for a while, trying to find one that lines up with my off season the best that it can. But yeah, I'd say right now most of my time is invested in TPI and NKT.
Nice. Well, when it comes to the off season, you couldn't time a better location and timing of the year to be in Vegas. You know, you're in Vegas when it's kind of decent. During the in season, it's not boiling necessarily. Well, October gets kind of hot, but all in all, in June, of course. But you're off. You don't stick around Vegas in the off season, do you? Do you go somewhere else? Head back to Pennsylvania?
Vegas is our home base. Vegas is our home base. We'll go back to Pennsylvania for about 2 or 3 weeks typically in the off season, but Vegas is my home base. We like it there. It's hot. I mean, it's hot in July and August. It's no joke, that's for sure. But what everyone always told me when I moved there was it's a dry heat, which is what everyone says, and it is true. I mean, I am soft with humidity now. If I'm somewhere where it's humid, my body is adjusted for sure.
But
And
so that's kind of my next question, and probably my last question because we're running out of time here. But you go on like a 10-day road series, and you're gone. Do you notice in terms of player health, ability, maybe even like occurrence of injury, if there's a difference between the beginning of a road trip and the end, partly because of different time zones, sleep patterns interrupted, or a long stretch of games that are kind of back to back? I'm just curious, if maybe not, but do you notice anything like that compared to
it's
being at
something
home for a
we're
while?
it's something we're trying to actually quantify and look at, to see if we have any trends at different points at where you're seeing. But ultimately, I mean, if at the end of a road trip, I mean, everyone's exhausted to a certain extent, because we're traveling, we're getting in late, we're sleeping late, we're constantly trying to stay ahead of the sleep side of things with appropriate supplementation that can be done, and make sure athletes are recovering the best they can. But I can't say I've noticed anything specifically to answer you, not to give you an answer to your question, but there are definitely there's definitely adaptations to travel. Staying in a seated position for 5-6 hours definitely does have its adaptations and change to the body, and we definitely do end up taking that into account when we're landing wherever we're going.
So curious, do you have like a landing program when you land in a city and the guys head back to their hotel? Do you have a little program that everybody follows just to open up their hips again, reduce distal hamstring tension from their knees being flexed, or whatever the case is? Is there anything like that?
We don't have anything formal, but we offer up the ability for guided workouts and guided mobility programs and treatment sessions. That's all available for the player to be able to consume. Yeah.
Right on. Well, Kyle, we're coming up against the clock, and I'm myself personally, I could keep on going and listening to your responses and replies for quite a long time, but maybe somewhere down the road after the season's over or whatever, we can kind of reconnect and have another conversation. But I truly appreciate your time, your knowledge, experience, and what you've shared today so far. So thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Thanks for the time.
And that's a wrap for this week of Zelos. I'd like to thank Kyle Moore and the Las Vegas Golden Knights organization for making this episode a reality. If you want to know more about Kyle, simply check out the description below for the links. As it just so happens, I'll be in Kyle's area this coming summer. I'll be presenting at the NSCA National Conference with a number of amazing leaders in the field of strength conditioning. The conference will be held at Caesars Palace from July 12th to the 15th. I'll also be giving a pre-conference presentation sponsored by Perform Better, so be sure to go to nsca.com for more information. Until next week, make it a good one.